Titled Understanding Communication, this is the introductory unit of the course in English Communication. As I mentioned in the course introduction, this unit has lectures meant to help you understand the area of communication. These lectures are not about communication in English specifically, but address communication as a larger concept. The lectures discuss communication as the act of sending or receiving information in any language through any medium and even without language. The lectures cover three topics: what's communication, barriers in communication, and the process of communication. All three are explained by P. Ajit Kumar, Professor of English Language Education at the Department of Training and Development, School of English Language Education, EFL University, Hyderabad. Please note that all the lectures are accompanied by texts for reading. You must read these texts once before and once after listening to the lecture. Lecture 1 is in a conversation format. We've shared the script of the conversation. As I said earlier, Lecture 1 also has a short reading text. Please read this text before listening to the conversation. Lecture 2 also has a reading text that is followed by an activity. Lecture 3 has only a reading text. However, your understanding of this text will be assessed in the weekly assignment. So do read this text carefully twice, once before and once after listening to the lecture. Hello learners, here I am in a conversation with Professor Ajit Kumar. He shared with us a short text on interpersonal communication. Please read that text before listening to this conversation. We start with section 1, a brief history of interpersonal communication. Professor Ajit Kumar, could you please paraphrase the contents of the text that we just read?
Well, Dr. Jose, the history of human communication is as old as humanity itself. Early humans, a few in number, must have had occasion, reasons, causes to interact or communicate with one another, though minimally. The subject of almost all that interaction or communication was survival.
That's right.
Survival in terms of food, survival in terms of living another day. The entire interaction between these people who were essentially individual but did collaborate with one another on the subject of survival must have been in 4 modes: visual, oral, tactile, and olfactory. If we were to look at each one of these one by one, visual represents all that is visible. It could be a heap of stones or branches of a tree or trees arranged in a particular fashion. Or it could be gestures like holding up their hand or pointing, or right? It could have been any of those. Even smoke was a visual sign. These signs communicated to the other some message. These signs had, in other words, message value. This kind or this mode of communication was perhaps one of the most prominent modes that our forefathers used.
Very interesting. How about the oral mode?
Well, the oral mode, it sort of translates into sounds.
Okay.
It's not about connected speech as we know it today, right? It's about sounds, and mostly guttural sounds, or sounds of nature that they were imitating, mimicking, right? These sounds, most of them again stand-alone sounds, not used in combination, they also had message value. So, particular guttural sound would come to mean perhaps availability of food or presence of danger, right? Or some such message that one of these human beings conveyed to another.
So we have now olfactory and tactile left. Could you tell us a bit about those?
That's very interesting. Tactile, as we all know, is about touch. It is fair to assume that our forefathers communicated using touch, right? Even today we communicate using touch. But our forefathers must have used touch sign to communicate a certain meaning. A pull or a push towards them, towards the individual, a poke in the individual's belly perhaps, right, or a pat or a thumb or a, all that could have served to communicate a certain message about food and or survival. Almost all these messages are or were about survival. That was their prime concern in those days, surviving. And food was an important aspect of survival, right? As far as olfactory goes, olfactory is about smell. Incidentally, even today, we communicate olfactorily. Can you think of an example?
Maybe when one uses perfume?
Absolutely. When we use a perfume, we are actually communicating a message. When we take pains to smell nice to the person we are communicating with, we are actually sending out a message. We are communicating that we respect, that we care, right? That we are serious about interaction and so on and so forth. Likewise, our forefathers in early days must also have communicated with one another, perhaps by smearing themselves with extracts of barks or leaves or some vegetation, or maybe smearing themselves with the blood or the fragrances that emanate from animals, right? Emissions of animals. They could have also have communicated perhaps by burning things. Burning certain tree barks together could communicate a certain message. The smell of certain tree barks burning could communicate a message, and the smell of burning of certain other tree barks or leaves would communicate a different message, right? The olfactory mode did communicate messages, though in a limited fashion, as compared to perhaps the other modes, right? But in all, these modes may or may not have operated on their own, or they could have acted in conjunction with one another.
Okay.
could have occurred concurrently. That is, maybe to convey a particular message or strengthen a particular message or to confirm a particular message, they had to use both the visual mode as well as the oral mode.
Okay.
Or maybe the oral mode happened in combination with the tactile mode, right? But these four modes were extensively used by our forefathers to interact with one another in those early days. And interestingly, if you notice, all four are non-verbal in nature.
Right. Fascinating, isn't it?
Indeed.
It's only going to get better. Next, we move to phase 2. Please recall this part of the text. Here's my question, Professor Ajit Kumar. In phase 2, you mentioned evolution. In which way was evolution a contributing factor in the emergence of speech?
Well, Dr. Jose, I did mention evolution, but that's not the only contributing factor. That is perhaps the most important of several contributing factors. But evolution played a very important role in the emergence of connected speech, or in the emergence of interpersonal, the evolution of interpersonal communication as well. For a long time, if you look at images of early humans, you would notice that they all had small heads. Now, small heads meant small brains, and small brains meant smaller cortexes. Now, as we all know, cortex is that part of the brain which is perhaps the most important part of the brain, which controls language, which controls reasoning, which controls thinking, and a lot of our mental processing is handled by the cortex. Early human beings had very small brains with very small cortexes. But as a result of evolution, the head sizes started growing, right? The bigger the head, the bigger the brain. And bigger the brain, bigger the cortex.
Right.
As a consequence of large size cortexes, a lot of change came about in the way humans lived, processed information, right, perceived themselves and the environment, and so on and so forth. So, around the same time when the cortexes developed, that's the time tool use emerged.
Right.
We don't need to go into the details, but as a consequence of the growth and development of human cortexes, individuals started making attempts to produce, convey information using connected speech, using more sounds. A consequence of developed cortexes, bigger cortexes, connected speech, early connected speech emerged. And early connected speech is not, again, I stated this earlier, let me say that again, is not the kind of speech that we are engaging in today, right? Early connected speech probably mimicked natural sounds that occur in nature. And and they were combined in a very crude, simple manner to form basic utterances. Right? They were not very long, complex strings of speech. This form of speech started getting better and more involved and more complex, and went on to become the most prominent mode of interaction between the humans of that time. Until then, all four, perhaps the four modes that we have already mentioned, they were more or less of equal importance. But with the emergence of speech as a consequence of evolution and other contributing factors, speech slowly started gaining prominence.
Professor Kumar, can you elaborate the connection between humans settling in communes and the consequent increase in quantum of information?
Well, that's a very interesting question. See, for a long time, humans were nomads, wanderers, hunter-gatherers. They had only one agenda, and that was to survive. And in order to survive, they had to eat. And food, they had to, nobody would give them food. They had to find their own, fend for themselves. Right? So there was a minimal amount of interaction, cooperation, collaboration in perhaps acquiring food, in obtaining food. But the interaction and collaboration was limited to that and just that. Otherwise, you are essentially on your own, right? Though they were essentially on their own, and they were wandering from place to place, right? They didn't own anything. They didn't belong to anybody or any place, and all they had to do was survive for another day. For a long time, our forefathers were like that. And the main source of food was what they hunted and killed. That was their main source of food. They survived on that. Eventually, some of these human beings who were in perhaps close proximity started settling down in groups in certain places. Right? Those groups, that kind of living in together in groups is known as communes. A commune is where you share information, you share possessions, and there is ownership, a sense of ownership, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Now, what could have caused this? It's not very clear, but it's very likely that the humans discovered alternate sources of food. Up till then, our forefathers were meat eaters. They hunted and killed what they needed to eat, like any other animal. But here, for some reason, when they settled down, something prompted them to do that. We won't go into the details of that, but something prompted them to come together and settle down and look for alternate sources of food. And that's when they discovered farming.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Now, farming is a different game altogether. Right? Earlier, hunting and gathering was relatively simple.
Right.
You hunt when you are hungry, you eat what you can, and discard the rest.
True.
But here, it was a different ball game altogether. You had to collaborate with one another actively. There was a lot of information about what can be grown, what cannot be grown, at what time it should be grown, what can be grown in conjunction with another, right? What time should it be harvested? Where should it be grown? Who is growing what? Right? There was an exponential explosion of information. The quantum of information which was very limited to what to eat next suddenly increased manyfold that the humans found it a little difficult to handle. It was not just the storing of information, it's also about retrieving. The information that emerged about farming, right? It had to be retrieved and reused.
Correct.
That also became a problem, right? Now, once they settled down in communes, it is not just about farming alone. They started cooperating with one another, and families, they started living together. The rudimentary form of a family as we know it, right? When they started living together, the partner was theirs. The offspring was theirs, right? The hut or the shelter they lived in was theirs. There an ownership and a sense of possession emerged, right? So up till then, the rock one used, or the rock axe one used to kill an animal for food did not belong to that individual. He may or may not hold on to it, but he didn't really claim possession. But here, the land they farmed, the land they invested their energy and effort in was theirs. The produce was theirs,
Right.
right? And this accumulated, all this is information, is data.
Okay.
This accumulated over a large period of time. So much so that the volume of data became unmanageable.
All right. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's why I said communes led to an explosion of information. The quantum of information increased manifold.
Correct. Yeah, I get that. The text also mentions a rememberer. Why did the rememberer arrangement fail?
Well, it's a very interesting concept actually. It is related to what we have just talked about.
Okay.
It reached such a point that it was impossible for any individual or group of individuals to store, recall, and reuse this information, this data. Right? And this information was crucial for their survival. This information that we are talking about, this quantum of information, of data, is in fact the tradition, the history of the group, of the community, right? And this had to be preserved.
Okay.
And preservation of these traditions, the traditions became a big challenge.
Right.
And our forefathers came up with an arrangement of a rememberer.
I see.
Right. Now, a rememberer is another human being, but he is chosen for his mental and physical agility.
Right.
Right. And then he is fed the entire story of the tribe, of the community. The entire history of the community is fed, is narrated to him. And he is encouraged and enabled to act as a repository of the community's traditions, history. But interestingly, that didn't last very long, right? For obvious reasons. I'm sure you'll be able to make a guess as to what could have gone wrong. The most obvious thing.
Too much information?
Too much information. Absolutely, too much information. See, there's a limit to what a human brain can hold and process, right? He or she could not handle it.
Correct.
The other reason or reasons could be that the rememberer could die in an accident. and then the entire community's tradition is lost forever. Or the rememberer could be kidnapped and held to ransom by somebody.
Possible, yeah.
Right? Even then, as early as then, people realized that knowledge is wealth, power.
That's right, yeah.
Right? All in all, it was fraught with far too many risks and issues and weaknesses that it was abandoned. It was given up, done away with.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I hope I have answered your question.
Absolutely, yes, very clear. So now we are at phase 4. What did early writing look like?
Well, writing, the story of writing is worth narrating, right? So let me explain that in a nutshell before I answer your question, specific question.
Okay.
Writing is, writing follows the rememberer arrangement, right? When the rememberer arrangement failed, the communities or the communes had to invent another means to store their voluminous information regarding their traditions, their values, their possessions, their connections, and so on, and their practices, right? Their culture. And the rememberer had obviously failed in doing that, and therefore they started looking for another medium which would not be corrupted very easily and which can store voluminous information without being overwhelmed, which would be easily accessible to anybody who wanted to access information from that. So that's when they discovered, they invented writing. They invented writing, not discovered, they invented writing.
Right.
Early writing, to come to your question, early writing was basically cuneiform writing. Cuneiform writing is actually a writing on clay tablets. Writing is not what it is now, those days. Early writing, they would use wedge-shaped instruments to make marks on wet tablets of clay, right? And inside those wedge-shaped markings, they would add other markings. Later on, that was followed by inscriptions made on stone.
Okay.
Right? The Egyptians did that. The Sumerians did the clay tablet, cuneiform writing. The Egyptians did inscriptions. That was much more permanent. The clay tablets, could break, could get dissolved in water. Some of the markings could get erased. But here in these granite slabs, the clay slabs were replaced by granite slabs. The marks were permanent. And that became much more dependable, right? That was then followed, or perhaps around the same time, in China and other parts of the country, an extract of the papyrus plant, the pith of the papyrus plant was used to make markings on it. Again, these markings did not look like writing that we are familiar with today. They were markings. So early writing, unlike today's writing, was mostly marks made on surfaces.
Okay.
Right? Started with wet clay tablets, progressed to stone tablets, and then to papyrus material, which is actually the pith of a papyrus plant, right? And today from papyrus paper emerged and so on.
Okay.
Right? So that's how early writing looked like. That's what early writing looked like.
Post writing, what were some of the milestones in interpersonal communication?
Post writing, yeah. Post writing, the major milestones that I can think of is print. Right, almost all writing early days were made, by humans using some inscription tool, some other kind of tool to make marks on the surfaces. But that evolved, and printing emerged. That is a major milestone in the history of interpersonal communication. And today, the most recent milestone is digital. Writing, digital communication, right? That is the most important, the most recent milestone that I can think of. In all this, I ought to say that writing emerged, or writing was invented by our forefathers not as a means of communication. In early days, writing had only one purpose, and that was to store information which could be retrieved. Right? But today, that has changed. Today, we use writing to convey all sorts of information, not just storing information, but also to convey our feelings, our emotions, right? Our thoughts, right? So the nature of, or the purpose of writing has changed drastically. That answers your question.
Yes, thank you. And here we move to section 2. How do we communicate? What exactly do we mean by a code in interpersonal communication?
Dr. Jose, a code is a system of signs. In order to communicate, we need something that can travel through channels. When you and I are communicating, the channel between us is now air, right? And the sign, I need a sign which will travel through this channel, which is air, to reach you, in order to convey my message to you.
Right.
So, a code is a system of signs that we need to convey our thoughts, our messages from one person to another. System of signs. All codes, they comprise two parts. One is a verbal component, and the other is a non-verbal component. By verbal component, I mean anything that is written or spoken. So all signs that are written or spoken are verbal in nature. Everything else is non-verbal.
Okay.
And a few examples of non-verbal component would be body language, the way one stands, the way one sits, the way one moves, right? Gestures, right? It could be the distance between two people, proxemics, as Edward Hall called it. It could be your possessions, artifactics, what you wear, what you own, the car, your room, your jewelry. It could be that. It could be haptics, where happiness and warmth and control is conveyed through a touch, right? So these are, and paralanguage. For that, it's again very important. Paralanguage is very important. Paralinguistic features in the verbal component: speed of delivery, volume of delivery, the pitch, the tone. All these are paralinguistic features, right?
Okay.
All these are non-verbal.
Okay.
Right? So words in general are verbal. Words are signs we use to communicate in the written or spoken format.
Right.
All other cues, all other behavior is non-verbal in nature. And a code consists of both verbal and non-verbal signs. It's a system of signs.
Okay. Let's move to the last section, section 3. Professor Ajit Kumar, in the text you tell us about the origin of the word communication. You've also given us a working definition. What is communication for you?
Well, if you ask me, the standard definition of communication is sharing information. You look up any dictionary, it will say sharing information. But it's much more to that definition than just those two words or that phrase alone. Now, there's lots more to the constituent terms or constituent words of that phrase. Let's start with sharing. Sharing information, as it were, is not just transmitting of information. It is much more than that.
Okay.
It is conveying your information. We'll talk about information in a minute. It is conveying your information in exactly the same way you experience it. For example, if information is emotion, right? I am conveying an emotion in exactly the same way I am experiencing that emotion. And you, the receiver, the recipient, should also be able to capture the same emotion with the same intensity and severity that I am experiencing it.
That's right.
Right? That is what we mean by sharing. Sharing cannot be dismissed as just transmitting information. Right? The second term in the phrase is information. In communication parlance, information is anything and everything you seek to convey to the other person. Information is not just about it's not information as we normally think of. Information, the meaning of information is not is in a very limited or a restricted fashion. In our normal day-to-day interactions. But in communication parlance, information is everything. All data is information, right? Your emotions, your desires, your thoughts, your feelings, your intention, all that is information, right? So when you put these two together, when you are sharing information, you are not just sharing mechanical impersonal data alone, but you are actually, I am actually inviting you to feel what I feel, to see what I see, to hear what I hear, right? I'm not just telling you, I am inviting you into my mind to experience what I am experiencing. That's what communication is, and that's why it is so challenging and very difficult, right? It's easy to transfer information. Transferring information is child's play, transmitting information, but then it don't have the same intended effect that the communicator had. And therefore, in my opinion, for me, to answer your question, specific question, communication is doing your best to convey meaning, right, to the recipient, and the recipient trying to recreate the meaning, make meaning, right? Recreate the meaning that I intended him or her to perceive.
Okay.
Right? It is not just transmitting it. So if I am talking about pain, you should be able to empathize with me.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? If I am talking about happiness, you should be able to feel, experience the same sensation or emotion with me. Right? It's just not an impersonal, mechanical transference of data or information. It's much more than that. It is meaning making. And that makes communication very challenging and very complex. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, that's quite clear.
Thank you.
So, this has been a very exciting journey understanding communication. Thank you, Professor Ajit Kumar, for
You're
taking
welcome,
us through
Dr.
this.
Jose. Thank you.